Good morning and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akiriduluale. The headlines. Blasts heard at Saki military air base in Russian-controlled Crimea Peninsula. U.S. President Joe Biden signs documents of America's support for Sweden and Finland to join NATO. And officials in Brussels are skeptical of Ukrainian President Zelensky's demand for a general Russian travel ban, now echoed by Estonia and Finland. Start off this morning in the Russian-annexed city of Crimea, where one person has been reported killed by a blast at a military airbase at Saki. According to the Russian head of Crimea's administration, Sergei Aksyonov, 5 others were injured by the blast in the Crimean Peninsula. Crimea borders the southern Ukrainian region of Kherson, now controlled also by Moscow, and the southeastern region of Zaporizhzhia, partially occupied by the Russian army, is also nearby. Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, garnering a global commendation. Or nation, rather.
We have enough ambulances. Food is being provided here. Help to our colleagues from the Ministry of Defense is being provided completely. Situation here is under control. First of all, I would like to say that when I was talking about a 5-kilometer area, I meant the perimeter. But pieces could have spread over quite a long distance, obviously. Now the situation is under control. We will evacuate all residents of buildings which are situated close to the aerodrome. We are reaching out to them. We are assessing the amount of damage on site, but the main committees will be working tomorrow.
Meanwhile, Russia's defense ministry says the explosion at the military airbase in Crimea had been caused by a detonation of aviation ammunition and that there had been no casualties. The RIA Novosti news agency reports that there had been no attack and no military equipment had been damaged. 3 local witnesses earlier said they had loud explosions, several of them, and had seen black smoke rising from the direction of the Russian military airbase, also reporting congestion on the roads leading away from the coast. Russia, for decades, leased the naval port of Sevastopol, home of its Black Sea fleet, from Kiev, but in 2014 had annexed the entire peninsula from Ukraine in a move not recognized by a lot of other countries. Crimea has so far been spared the intense bombardment and artillery combat that have taken place in other areas of eastern and southern Ukraine since February the 24th, when President Vladimir Putin ordered Russian armed forces into Ukraine, including some based in the peninsula. While other eyewitnesses said they had heard at least 12 explosions around 3:20 local time at that airbase near Novorossiysk on the west coast of the Crimean Peninsula. According to those residents, there was an intense clap making the house shiver and smashing out the windows. As residential buildings in the area have been damaged, affected residents have been offered evacuation to a hostel in Saki. Evacuees say they were provided with decent housing conditions and meals. Crimea is a holiday destination for many Russians and had so far has been reported has been spared the bombardment and artillery combat that other areas of Ukraine have suffered. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is warning that the safety of the Black Sea region would remain under threat while Russia's annexation of Crimea continued. Mr. Zelensky's comments come after one person was reported killed when the Russian airbase near seaside resorts in the annexed Crimean Peninsula was rocked by blasts. Ukraine has not claimed responsibility for an attack, and Moscow says the blasts occurred after the detonation of stored ammunition, not the result of any attack. Mr. Zelensky did not directly mention the blasts in his daily video address on Tuesday night, but said it was right that people were focusing on Crimea.
Dear Ukrainians, today a lot of attention is turned towards Crimea, and rightly so, because Crimea is Ukrainian and we will never repudiate it. We will not forget that the Russian war against Ukraine started with the occupation of Crimea. Russia transformed our peninsula, which also was one of the best places in Europe, into one of the most dangerous places in Europe. Russia brought to Crimea massive oppression, economic problems, an economic dead end, and war. The presence of Russian occupiers in Crimea is a threat for all of Europe and to the global stability. The Black Sea region cannot be a safe place while Crimea is occupied. There could not be a stable and lasting peace for countries bordering the Mediterranean, while Russia has the capability of using our peninsula as its military base.
Away from Crimea and the attack there, U.S. President Joe Biden has signed documents endorsing Finland and Sweden's accession to NATO, the most significant expansion of the military alliance since the 1990s as it responds to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. President Biden signed the U.S. instrument of ratification, welcoming the two countries, the final step for the endorsement by the United States. The U.S. Senate backed the expansion by an overwhelming 95-1 vote last week, a rare display of bipartisan unity in a bitterly divided Washington. Both Democratic and Republican senators strongly approved membership for the two Nordic countries, describing them as important allies whose modern militaries already worked closely with NATO. The vote was a sharp contrast with some rhetoric in Washington during the administration of former Republican President Donald Trump, who pursued an America-first foreign policy and criticized NATO allies who failed to reach defense spending targets.
Today, we take another important step toward bringing Sweden and Finland in NATO. In just a few minutes, I'm going to sign the U.S. instrument of ratification, making the United States the 23rd ally to approve Sweden and Finland's membership to the strongest, most powerful defensive alliance in the history of the world. Together with our allies and partners, we're going to write the future we want to see, the future we want to see. And in a moment when Putin's Russia has shattered peace and security in Europe, when autocrats are challenging the very foundations of a rule-based order, the strength of the transatlantic alliance and America's commitment to NATO is more important than it's ever been. Putin thought he could break us apart when this all started. He believed he could break us apart, in my view, weaken our resolve. Instead, he's getting exactly what he did not want. He wanted the Finlandization of NATO, but he's getting the NATOization of Finland along with Sweden. I really mean it. Today, we see all too clearly how NATO remains an indispensable alliance for the world of today and the world of tomorrow. Our alliance is closer than ever. It is more united than ever. And when Finland and Sweden bring the number of allies to 32, we'll be stronger than ever, stronger than ever.
Meanwhile, the United States has announced that it would provide $89 million to Ukraine for removing landmines put in place by Russian forces. The money will support 100 demining teams, as well as the training and equipment of more Ukrainian personnel to undertake the risky work across the estimated 16 million hectares of territory that Kiev says has been mined by the Russians. The U.S. Department of State said in a statement that Russia's unlawful and unprovoked further invasion of Ukraine has littered massive swathes of the country with landmines, unexploded ordnance, and improvised explosive devices. Let's talk now to a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, Nick Whitney. Mr. Whitney joins us from London in the United Kingdom. Good morning to you. Thank you for your time.
Good morning to you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to start with what we've been reporting this morning. 2 points, actually. The first is the U.S. signing of the accession documents for Sweden and Finland. Do you think this could broaden, shall we say, the theater of conflict, potential conflict with Russia in the coming days and weeks, especially because in the not too far past, Russia had made it clear that if those two countries joined NATO as opposed to the EU, it was going to react in some way?
No, I don't think it can broaden the area of conflict, to be honest. Obviously, the Russians will make those kind of threats in order to pursue their general campaign of trying to make particularly Europeans feel that the stance that Europeans have taken on the invasion of Ukraine is somehow a risk to them. But I don't think there's I think the Russians have much more than they can handle on their plates already with their operations in Ukraine, and the chances of them opening up a new front in some fashion against, say, the Baltic states or even Finland are minimal. With Joe Biden on this, I saw your clip where he basically said this is an own goal by the Russians. This is an unlooked for strategic defeat that has flowed out of the invasion of Ukraine.
Given that scenario, let's look at when you talk about full plates and Joe Biden and indeed a couple of other people in all of this. I mean, you have the NATO story on one hand, you have the Taiwan, US, China issue on the other hand, and then sometime in mid-October, the US is participating in some military drills with India on a disputed border with China. And all of this plays into some of the fallout of this Russia-Ukraine conflict. So I want to use that very colorful phrase you used, plates full. Talking about plates full, is there a danger here on all sides of overreach?
I think there is. I think Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan was a mistake. I think Joe Biden tried to dissuade her. One hears that the American military tried to dissuade her from doing it. It was gratuitous. I'm not sure what it achieved. It was very badly timed in the run-up to this autumn when Xi Jinping plans to make himself effectively president for life of China. So we wait to see how events shake out in the coming days and weeks. But the Chinese reaction has obviously been at the extreme end of what commentators expected. They have made it plain that they are absolutely furious with this Pelosi visit. So I think there is a severe risk that, certainly from the American point of view, they will have much more difficult foreign affairs to cope with, whether it's Russia and Ukraine or tensions in the Western Pacific, than they actually feel comfortable coping with. Plus, of course, there is what should concern the whole of humanity. It's the Chinese withdrawal of cooperation with the US on climate change, which is a devastating response, really, from the Chinese, and very irresponsible of them. They will turn around and say, well, the Americans have been, that's 4 years under Donald Trump of withdrawing cooperation on climate change, and they'd be right. But two wrongs don't make a right.
Let's look at something else. Of course, all of this that you talk about, the possibility of overreach here, and some of the reactions and counter-reactions, Nancy Pelosi's visit, the support for Ukraine in spite of a bit of economic challenge, that it all plays into the politics of the coming elections in November, the midterm elections, and that's why everybody's position seems to be quite hard. On either side of the divide, they're not prepared to listen to all of this. Take, for example, the FBI raid on Donald Trump's residence a couple of hours ago before this. So how much damage is the intrusion of politics, the U.S. internal politics in this case, into all of this, especially because both sides are no longer quite showing the bipartisan unity that was very apparent at the start of the situation in Ukraine. It seems as if, well, we've gone back to more of business as usual, if you like that phrase.
Well, I think there is a worry that, we've lived for decades, actually, with some sense that Americans were the adults in the global room. Now, I know that was by no means a universally held view around the world, and there are many examples that people could throw at me of cases where the US seemed to have behaved in a very nationalistic, imperialistic way. There's plenty of dispute about Iraq or Afghanistan or many of their policies in Central America. But you did sort of get the feeling that ultimately there was a foreign policy establishment in Washington which would be measured and no doubt, serving the American interest ultimately, but this powerful country, which styled itself the leader of the free world, was a stabilizing factor in international relations. I think that's very difficult to see that now, particularly after 4 years of Trump very explicitly saying that America wanted to give up this role as global policeman and didn't care what happened to the rest of the world and wants to pull out of the Middle East and pull out of Afghanistan and pull out of everywhere and concentrate on building a wall around itself. So I do think that we are in a rather... Joe Biden has tried to reverse that a bit, but as you rightly say, the prospects for the November elections are very uncertain and at worst could fatally damage Biden's authority. So I do think we are in a rather dangerous multipolar world where we have to rely on a lot of different actors behaving with a modicum of responsibility. And I'm not sure we're actually seeing that happening at the moment.
Let's come to an unlikely theater that has come to prominence here, and that's talking about the African continent. First, Sergei Lavrov was here a couple of weeks ago on the African continent, drumming up support for Russia and trying to get diplomatic relations going in a number of places as well as trade. That was quickly followed by Emmanuel Macron of France, which has a very deep relationship with many African countries. And then the most recent is Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, who is also, as we speak, in Africa. How come the war in Ukraine has suddenly put Africa in so much spotlight in this way? And do you think that at the end of the day, Africa may not come away from this just confused, if you like?
I think and hope that Africa will come away from all this advantaged. It seems to me there's no harm at all from the African perspective in having a number of great powers, if I may use that phrase, competing for attention. And I think if I were African, I would take the view that I don't want to be necessarily dependent always on the Americans, or always on the Chinese, or whoever it may be. And I suppose, it is Ukraine, it is the whole sort of diplomatic, geopolitical game. It's also energy costs, because all Europeans are desperately scrambling around for new sources, particularly of gas, but of oil as well, to see us through the winter, which is going to be a very, very difficult time for Europeans to live through. Placing a big question mark against how solid European support for Ukraine will be by the time we reach January, and more and more people are faced with the choice between having the heating on in the house or enough food to put on the table. So these are difficult times. I don't think it alters the fundamental wrongness of the original of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. He's behaving like an historical czar. I think it was Catherine the Great who said, I know of no way to defend my borders other than to expand them. I mean, I think this Russian mindset of Greater Russia is highly dangerous to the world. But as I began by saying, I think from an African perspective, it may be an ill wind, it may be a damaging business for the international rules-based order, it may be violations of human rights and all those things we don't want to see. But if it's an ill wind that blows you some good, well, I expect you should be able to look at the good and not wholly regret how developments are working out. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, there'll be those who hope you are, but there'll be those who will be nodding their heads in agreement with you. Nick Whitney, thank you so much for your time and for your perspective this morning. We'll be back with you in the not-too-distant future. Thank you so much.
I've enjoyed it.
Coming up after the break, U.S.-Russia trade continues to plunge with the sharpest decline recorded in shipments of nuclear fuel and palladium. Stay with us. Welcome back to the program. The Kremlin has dismissed Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's call for a travel ban on all Russians as irrational, saying that Europe would ultimately have to decide if it wanted to pay the bills for what it describes as Mr. Zelensky's whims. The Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said there was no chance Russians could be isolated from the rest of the world. The Ukrainian leader had told the Washington Post newspaper that current Western sanctions against Moscow were too weak, adding that the West should close its borders to Russians. His remarks stand in stark contrast to the first days of Moscow's military intervention in Ukraine, when Mr. Zelensky used to reach out to Russian-based Kremlin critics in Russian. To all Russian travelers, with one official telling the Financial Times on Tuesday that the bloc did not want a complete ban. This followed calls from politicians in Estonia and Finland to do so, echoing a demand by Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas tweeted on Tuesday that the EU should stop issuing tourist visas to Russians, adding that visiting Europe is a privilege and not a human right. With air travel shut down, Kallas noted Russia's neighbors Estonia, Latvia and Finland carry the burden of processing all Schengen visas. Time to end tourism from Russia now. Over 100 million Russians actively live on the European side of the continent's largest country, and that Russia also has borders with Poland and Lithuania. Moscow calls the idea irrational, as we've just been reporting, and said implementing it would expose the EU's true nature once and for all. Let's listen to Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov.
The statement speaks for itself. Irrationality in this case goes through the roof. We can see it only in a very negative way. Any attempts to isolate Russians or Russia have no chances. Zelensky himself should understand that European countries which are trying to punish Russia, as they say, are already paying for it actively. Countries are paying the bills, citizens are paying the bills. Sooner or later, these countries will start to ask whether Zelensky does right things and whether their citizens should pay the bills for his whims.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the problem America has with Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that it is not only an aggression against another country, but an aggression against the foundational principles of the international system. He made this known during his visit to South Africa, where he spoke alongside his counterpart, Naledi Pandor, as Minister for International Relations. On her part, Ms. Pandor says South Africa does not support war and wishes to see efforts at increased diplomacy through the United Nations and other weighty leaders.
There's a profound agreement between us that we want to be spending our time focused on the issues that are really having an impact on the lives of our people. And together, it's what we did with the strategic dialogue today, we can make a real difference. But it's also important that when some of the basic principles of the international system, the international order, are being challenged, that we stand up and defend them. So the problem that we have with Russia's aggression against Ukraine is that it's not only an aggression against another country, it's an aggression against the foundational principles of the international system. Multilateralism, something that we both believe in and invest in. The United Nations Charter, which puts at its heart the sovereignty and independence of nations. And it was created in large part to try to, after 2 world wars, to make sure that there wasn't another one. And the basic principles that it established were designed to do that. But if we allow a big country to bully a smaller one, to simply invade it and take its territory, then it's going to be open season, not just in Europe, but around the world. And we'll have repercussions here and repercussions everywhere, which is why we've felt it important to stand up for those principles. And we hope see, as the Ukrainian president has said, this resolved diplomatically over time. But meanwhile, we have to defend the proposition that Ukraine's sovereignty and independence matter. They matter to Ukrainians, but they also matter to the world.
There is no one in South Africa who supports war. We've made that very clear. And we have said that we wish to see intensified efforts at increased diplomacy, utilizing the good offices of the United Nations, particularly the Secretary General, and other leaders who may be of weight in terms of persuading the interlocutors to come around a table and negotiate a settlement of this awful conflict. This is the position of South Africa. We support a search for peace. We are appalled by war. We abhor war because it brings untold suffering, which is something we experienced under apartheid. So this is the position that we have.
David Stone is a professor of Russian Studies at the Strategic and Policy Department of the Naval War College at Rhode Island in the United States. Joins us now virtually from there. Good morning to you. Thank you for your time this morning.
Good morning, and thank you.
Let's take off from where we ended, the issue of diplomacy. Many people would have thought that when the grain deal was reached with much fanfare, maybe now just over 2 weeks ago, perhaps some more intense diplomacy would follow because everyone was in the room. The Russians were there, the Ukrainians were there, the United Nations was there, and then Turkey was there acting as an interlocutor as well. But that doesn't seem to have happened yet. Does that come to you as a surprise?
Not particularly. I think the fundamental problem with negotiating an end to the war at this point is that the positions of the two sides are so far apart. Zelensky in Ukraine has said that he has no intent of a peace settlement that involves surrendering Ukrainian territory, that he wants the integrity of Ukraine restored. And for Vladimir Putin on the other side, it seems clear that that's not going to happen. He's not willing to accept that. And so at present, with both sides holding positions that are irreconcilable, that Russia wants Ukrainian territory and Ukraine wants liberation of its territory, at the moment, there doesn't seem to be a lot of room for middle ground. Now, the question will be in the months to come, will exhaustion with the war lead one or both sides to moderate its position and decide to accept less than what it would want?
It does seem also that there is the cut-paw strategy going on here in the sense that both sides you've just mentioned, both Russia and Ukraine, also have bigger elephants than them who are guiding and in some ways giving direction to what's going on within the room. Take Ukraine, for example. It's got NATO and the EU, the United States, of course, at the head of both, in its strong support, and probably will take no step without their backing. On the other hand, you have Russia being backed to a lesser extent by China and countries like India and all of that, and Russia will probably be synergizing with those countries before it accepts anything, as you pointed out, to end this. Is it a strategy, do you think, to bring those bigger elephants into a separate room and get them to agree on something, and then get these combatants actually to come in and then try to synthesize those roles? We have seen it done before.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And let me stress here that I'm speaking only personally, not in any official capacity. In terms of Ukraine, one of the things that's quite striking is the level of Ukrainian resistance. Now, obviously, Ukraine's resistance has depended to a great deal on support from outside. And without that outside support, it would be much more difficult for Ukraine to resist in the way that it has. But Zelensky is in a position where his country's been invaded. Tens of thousands of his people have been killed. And so it's not clear that the Ukrainian people particularly want to stop fighting at this point. Certainly he does not. And so the degree to which the U.S. or the European Union or NATO could dictate to Ukraine to stop fighting is not clear. Certainly the U.S. and Europe could theoretically cut off aid, but I don't see that happening at any point soon. Likewise, on the Russian side, certainly China has not condemned the Russian action. But Russia is fighting this war really without much in the way of material assistance from China. And so there's not aid for China to cut off at this point. China, in theory, could condemn Russian actions. But in the same way, I don't see any moves in that direction. I think the fundamental question about who decides when this war ends is if Russia decides it's going to stop its invasion, or if Ukraine is in a position where it's forced to accept that it can no longer hope for liberation of its territory.
Let's look at some of the other things that are falling out from the war in Ukraine, if you like. I was talking to my previous guest, Nick Whitney, about some of the other things that have now come out of this conflict. One, the situation with Taiwan and China as well, involving the United States. The situation involving India and China involving the United States. And the expansion of NATO with Finland and Sweden joining. The U.S. has just accepted that officially now that they can. Now, those 3 points bring me to the question, is this conflict unwittingly being broadened beyond what we knew as at February the 25th after Russia invaded Ukraine?
I think no. And the reason I say that is that these issues that you brought up have been issues for years in the past. To take the points you raise, Finland and Sweden joining NATO, I don't think broadens the conflict in Europe. And the reason is that Russia has all it can handle. It's clear that the Russian army has had all they can handle in fighting the war in Ukraine. And it does not seem to make sense for Russia to expand a conflict that is, at the moment, seems beyond its capabilities. And so I think that Finland and Sweden joining NATO did not offer the prospect of an expansion of the conflict. Likewise, the Taiwan issue has been there for decades. And Nancy Pelosi's visit has turned the heat up on that. But that's something that's happened before and likely will happen again, that some particular incident, whether diplomatic or some other international event, will raise the temperature on the Taiwan question. And that happens, and then after a while, that tends to go away. And likewise, the China-India conflict, potential conflict or border incidents, that's something that recurs. Every few years, there's an incident there. These have happened together in time right now, but this is not something particularly, I think, new. These are the sorts of issues that occur in international politics, and they all have their own dynamics, and they're not necessarily closely connected one with another.
Let's look at Europe as a whole now. Because apart from the United States, Europe has been Ukraine's strongest backer, and Europe would be at the epicenter of the conflict as it is now, and if it were to expand. Europe has displayed, some would say, surprising unity in the face of this conflict, but that does appear to be slight differences in opinion, which are becoming slightly more deep. At this point. Italy has a governance issue at the moment. Hungary, of course, under Viktor Orban, has made it clear that it does not intend to cut off Russia or Russian gas. Germany is having similar problems. And then all the countries in Europe, including just recently departed Britain, are having economic challenges as a result of this conflict and the spiral-on effect of energy. Going forward, do you think the unity displayed will remain, or are we likely to see a situation where some are likely to take a back seat while others continue in front?
So that is an excellent question, and it's impossible to say with any degree of certainty. You're absolutely correct that Europe has shown remarkable unity thus far with some of these issues that you have raised. One of the questions is going to be, as in the months to come, how this develops. How much are economic sanctions going to hurt Russia? To what degree are limitations on Russian energy to Europe going to hurt Europe? And both sides are working to try to alleviate those things. Russia is trying to get out from under sanctions. Europe is looking to broaden its sources of energy away from Russia. And so both those are things that can happen. One point that I would raise, though, is that the nature of the Ukraine-Russia conflict is that Russia doesn't have to worry about what its allies think, because Russia doesn't have allies in this. As I've said, the Chinese have not condemned Russia, but there's not been a great deal of evidence of active support for Russia on this. The nature of having lots of countries backing Ukraine is that they're not all going to agree on everything. But certainly I would much rather be in Ukraine's position and having lots of friends abroad that are supporting it than in Russia's position, where it's essentially acting unilaterally. That's not a particularly good position to be in.
Before I let you go, I must ask this a final question. So much has been made about activity at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, with accusations by either side talking about shelling the plant or using it as a base to launch attacks on other parts of Ukraine. But I read something quite frankly frightening over the last weekend, where someone had indicated that if Russia, as you pointed out, without allies, feels that it is quite possible that it might have a problem with this conflict that it launched, it might resort, as it had threatened, to nuclear weapons. And that would be an entirely different ballgame. Do you see that on the horizon at all?
That is, of course, the most frightening possibility would be nuclear escalation. And Russia has used those threats in the past. I'm not aware of evidence that Russia is moving in any way towards doing that, but the threat is still there, and certainly that is something to be concerned about. And the question is, the use of nuclear weapons, with the complications that would bring, would be the efforts of a suicidal regime. And as yet, Russia's regime does not look suicidal. It has taken clearly some very unwise steps, aggressive steps in the invasion of Ukraine. But that level of recklessness seems a degree beyond what we have seen thus far. Again, absolutely something that we need to be concerned about and looking at, but at the moment, no signs of that becoming an active threat.
Many, many people listening to you around the world would sincerely hope that you're completely correct. Thank you very much, David Stone, for your time and for your perspective this morning. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And still to come on Russian invasion, a Brooklyn product design company raises more than $120,000 to make a Zelensky action figure. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Ukraine is expected to be able to export up to 6 million tons of grain per month now that the Black Sea ports in the country's south have reopened to export desperately needed grain. Until last week, only 2 million tons of grain a month was leaving Ukraine through the country's alternative overland routes. So this extra capacity will begin to free up overflowing grain silos. That's according to Ukrainian experts. Last week, a maritime humanitarian corridor was opened as the Black Sea Grain Initiative agreed amongst the UN, Ukraine, Russia, and Turkey went into effect, allowing the departure of 3 vessels, 2 from the port of Chernomorsk and 1 from Odessa, carrying a total of just over 58,000 tons of corn. The newly reopened shipping routes are being overseen by a joint coordination center. Ukrainian officials are also optimistic about the country's grain export in the near future. And supplies of Russian goods to the United States have fallen to their lowest level in 18 years. News outlet RBK reported, citing data from the U.S. Census Bureau. June imports from Russia to the U.S. amounted to $661 million, the lowest since February of 2004, when they stood at $653 million. The figure dropped 1.7 times in 1 month and was nearly 5 times lower than the monthly average of $2.5 billion in 2021. According to census data, the sharpest decline was recorded in shipments of nuclear fuel, platinum group metals, and fertilizers. U.S. imports of Russian nuclear fuel fell to less than 3 million in June, down from nearly $114 million in May. Imports of Russian platinum group metals, including palladium, fell to $76.3 million compared to $258.5 million the previous month, while supplies of mineral fertilizers also plunged, despite the fact that Washington removed these from the list of sanctioned goods to $88.8 million against $135.5 million in May. Let's talk to Ini John McQuarrie, business desk, who joins me, as always, at this time. Morning, Ini.
Good morning.
Now, let's look at this. So it's not just gas that Russia has to sell to Europe, and which Europe is trying to get itself off. It's also coal.
Yeah, coal.
How is that?
It actually starts today.
Okay.
From today, you know, they had the agreement. It had some timelines where they said by the end of this year, they're going to win themselves of oil and then eventually gas and all of that. So from today, Europe is not supposed to get coal from Russia anymore, from today, the 10th of August. That was the agreement. And I mean, we know that the biggest thing here is gas. Right. After that, then oil, and then coal. But guess what? Russia still makes 8 billion euros from selling coal to Europe every year. 8 billion euros. So that means that Russia will not have that money anymore. Money coming in. But of course, on the other side, we also know that Europe will not have that energy anymore that they get from coal. But guess what? So between when this announcement was done and today, there's been an increase of importation of coal.
In the hope that we can somehow keep some of them.
Germany, I think Argentina, and some of those countries, they aggressively imported coal, you know, at least to sustain them for some time.
In the hope that possibly the conflict could end, and then they might not need to keep so much store.
Exactly. So about the embargo will affect 22.6% of all Russian coal. But the thing is, India and Turkey have been enjoying part of this. Now, in May alone, the increase, the exports of coal to India went up by 25%, and they're enjoying between 25 and 30% discount of the price that they sell. So one man's meat is another man's price.
Absolutely. And now oil prices, I'm happy you mentioned those. Oil prices have eased a bit.
Yes, it's eased because, well, yesterday it went up because there's a pipeline that goes through Ukraine and then supplies to the other parts of Europe. Now, that has been shot. That has been shot because Ukraine is saying that because of the sanctions, because, of course, it comes from Russia and goes through Ukraine and all of that, it's been shot because Ukraine said they've not been able to collect their dues, their fines, because of the payment system, of course, the unfriendliness that is going on between both countries.
Yeah, and definitely Ukraine would be an unfriendly country.
Yeah, and you know the president of Ukraine has been talking a lot about, Europe should shut off the gas and shut off everything. But of course, countries have their economy to consider, the health of their person, of their citizens, because there's cold. You know, how are they going to?
And the longer this goes on, the more we get into the cold.
Yes. So I mean, UK is even talking about having a winter without energy now. We don't know how they're going to cope because energy prices. In fact, the other day they had a protest where they have some signatories who are saying they don't want to pay for energy anymore. You know, because of the hiking price.
Is it that they want to be given free?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I was asking Juliana. I mean, I thought it was only Nigerians that be like this.
That like free things. There's, of course, global food inflation, which is also easing, not least because of this grain deal that we keep talking about.
Yes.
But is that all?
No, that's not all. That's not all. Well, you see, the easing would have been a good time for the country at this time, but there's some other factors also. So this is the 4th month that, according to I think the World Bank, we're seeing ease in food prices globally, not in Nigeria. We always have to bring this home.
I think it was you, or maybe it was Ladi, who said that Nigeria bucks the trend when it comes to that. You know, when the prices go up, they don't come back down.
They don't come back down,
regardless of what happens.
So, but there's been, you know, there's some factors even before the war that have also been affecting production. One is the weather. We've spoken a lot about extreme weather in Europe these days, in the UK, and it's affecting crops. And unfortunately, now we see that a lot of countries are going back to coal, which doesn't help that weather that we are talking about, you know. But that has also been affecting. So even though there's easing of prices, it's not circulating. You know, we do hope that more, I think I heard you talk about...
more ships.
Exactly, leaving Ukraine, that maybe it will trickle down. So even though we do see prices going down in, you know, in patches, we do not see it trickling down and affecting as many countries and as many people as it should have. So crops are going down in some places, but the fact that production has also reduced because, of course, once demand is more than supply, then price will certainly go up. But, you know, interesting, I have this thing, talking about inflation. I don't know if I have the time right now. You do have. Okay. So some countries have been doing something because of the issue of inflation. So countries or governments are not just leaving the people to sort it out yourself or deal with it. You have to pay more tax because the government needs money. For instance, in France, on the 3rd of August, the Parliament adopted 20 billion euros inflation relief package to help the people, you know. And then in Italy, they approved aid package worth about 17 billion euros also to ease taxes, to give tax holidays, you know, to individuals and help little companies or small companies to deal with it. In Poland, they introduced a payment holidays relief scheme for individuals holding mortgage. You know, yesterday we talked about Russia and how they're not able to pay. So Poland maybe have that kind of a problem, or they see it coming, so they have
They're
this.
taking this preemptive measure.
In US, they have $430 billion plan that are, among other things, supposed to lower the cost of prescription drugs, talking about health. You know, because inflation, of course, has affected everything.
All these items, indeed.
In Brazil, they've been pressuring the state-owned energy giant to cut petrol prices. In Nigeria, we have higher prices. I don't know if I should go on. I don't know if I should go on. I'm sure
quite a lot of people know where you're going.
No, in Nigeria, we are paying 12.5% for telecommunications. 5% more.
Yes.
So what are these countries doing?
We're going to be paying more elsewhere. We're going to be paying more elsewhere. But one only hopes the right people are listening and taking the right lessons.
And that Nigerians will choose the right people in the coming
elections. Yes, indeed. Thank you so very much, Edie.
Thank you.
More on A Business Morning after this program, and Business Incorporated later on in the day. A quick check of the sports. Russian world number 1 Daniil Medvedev has insisted that playing under a neutral flag does not weigh on his mind. Tennis governing body banned Russia and Belarusian athletes from international team competitions following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which Moscow calls a special operation, but allowed players from the two countries to continue competing as neutrals. Medvedev, fresh off lifting the trophy in Los Cabos at the weekend, said that just being able to play tennis was all that mattered. Meanwhile, the International Chess Federation will establish a working group that will revisit its decision on banning Russian and Belarusian teams from international tournaments. This comes after Russian Arkady Djokovic was re-elected as president of the federation during its General Assembly in India's Chennai. Djokovic said Russia and Belarus are prominent members of the federation, and they could be reinstated into the body in the coming months. The International Chess Federation banned Russia and Belarus from team competitions, but players from these countries are allowed to participate in individual tournaments under a neutral flag. And finally, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who has been fighting a Russian invasion since February the 24th, is now an action figure thanks to a kickstart campaign by New York-based Brooklyn product design company FC Troy. The drive, launched less than 2 weeks ago, hit its 30,000 funding goal in 3 hours and has raked in over $120,000. For every figure sold, $1 goes to Ukraine in the campaign, which is expected to end on Friday. A 6-inch, 15-centimeter tall clay prototype of the Zelensky action figure, molded by Seattle artist Mike Levitt, will be mass-produced in plastic in China and is expected to ship thereafter. That's our program this morning. Thanks for being with us. I'm Ladi Akiridulale. Good morning.